Hello and welcome to another Mr. Smith history here on YouTube. This particular video is about William the Conqueror and about William taking control. So it's the various ways in which William adopted to try and control the Anglo-Saxons after defeating Harold in 1066. So sit back, have a watch, and I hope you enjoy it. We're going to start now with having a look at how William takes control. His victory at Hastings, obviously, that marked the beginning of Norman rule in England, but it certainly wasn't the he certainly didn't have full control. Defeating Harold was really just the start. He had to establish his authority over a country where he and his Norman followers were vastly outnumbered by the Anglo-Saxon population. So how did he manage to control the people? How did he manage to consolidate his power? And this video is going to have a look at those things, as I've already said. And we're going to have a look at this first reason there, which you can see. We're going to be looking at the feudal system. So I guess we need to look at what was the feudal system. Well, it was a hierarchy, a hierarchical structure. Basically, it's where land was exchanged for military service and loyalty. When he was victorious at Hastings, William seized large estates, large swathes of land from Anglo-Saxon nobility. William essentially claimed the country as his own. And those people who had resisted his rule and those people who were defeated at Hastings, their land was redistributed amongst his Norman followers. So he started to, get a foothold. These lands were granted exchange for a pledge of military service to the king, creating a chain of loyalty that linked every level of society back to William. So you've got a triangle, if you like, and at the top of this system you've got the king, and just below him we have the barons, and they receive extensive estates directly from the king. Now these in turn, the barons would then portion out their land to another set of people who were below them in the system. They were knights, and they would serve as armed retainers. So the arrangement was that the barons remained loyal as they depended on William for their wealth and power, and additionally it meant that William could call upon the knights of the barons to fight if he needed an army, so he could control large amounts of area. But that's only a very small amount of the population. The majority of the population, they were at the bottom of the feudal system, and that would mainly be like your peasants and such like. They were bound to the land. They had to provide food, they had to provide labour or other resources to their local lord and knight in exchange for protection and the right to work the land. This structure made it nearly impossible for peasants to challenge this new order, and it really cemented the Normans' control over the Anglo-Saxon population. So now we're going to talk about castles. So if you imagine you're living in England right after 1066, suddenly you would start seeing these huge structures, mainly wooden structures at first, popping up all over the place. These would have been an intimidating sight, and they would have been your major sign that the Normans had arrived, because before that there weren't many castles in England at all. William changed it really quickly, and he built over 500 castles within just a few decades. One of them is the Tower of London, which he started, which he began construction in 1078. So these castles were built in a specific style. They were known as Motte and Bailey Castles. The Motte was a large mound with a wooden or stone keep at the top, while the bailey was a fenced courtyard at the base of the mound. The castle was strategically placed. It was usually near important towns, river crossings and roads. And this wasn't just done randomly. William placed them where they were needed so that he could control key areas and keep an eye on the population. For example, Warwick Castle was built to watch over the Midlands. York Castle was constructed to control the rebellious regions of the north, which we'll have a look at a little bit more in a moment. So why so many castles? Well, they weren't just military bases, as I alluded to earlier. They were also symbols of Norman power. They reminded the Anglo-Saxons that the Normans were in charge now, and resistance wouldn't end very well. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons were often called castles oppressive fortresses. Castles were also used as administrative centres, where the Normans could collect taxes and hold court. The rapid construction of castles showed that William wasn't just going to sit back and hope that everyone would accept this rule. He was going to take action and make sure that they did. So, not all of William's methods were about building systems and building structures like castles. When faced with strong resistance, he wasn't afraid to use brutal force, and one of the most famous and horrifying examples of this was the harrying of the north. So this took place from 1066 to 1070, when the north of England rose up in rebellion. The northern rebels were supported by Danish invaders and some of the remaining Anglo-Saxon nobility like Edgar Etheling, the last heir of the old royal family. William's response though was extreme. He ordered his troops to burn villages, destroy crops, kill livestock across Yorkshire and beyond. This was known as a scorched earth tactic, and it created a famine. Food supply was wiped out. Some historical sources estimate that up to 100,000 people died as a result of the harrying, either from starvation or from the cold. So William's goal was simple. It was to break the spirit of the rebels and prevent future uprisings. And the impact was devastating. Entire villages were abandoned, and the population of the north was significantly reduced. Even years later, the Domesday Book, which was written in 1086, recorded that large areas of the Yorkshire were still waste and uninhabitable due to the devastation caused by the harrying. And I think this just goes to show how far William was willing to go to establish control and make sure that the Anglo-Saxons took the knee and listened and understood that he was now in charge. The harrying was a turning point, really. After this, there was far fewer large-scale rebellions against the Normans as the Anglo-Saxons realised that William really meant business. William ordered the creation of one of the most famous documents in English history, and it's called the Domesday Book. This was like a giant survey that covered almost the entire country. It listed who owned which pieces of land, how much it was worth, who lived there, and even how many pigs or sheep or other animals they might have had. The survey took less than a year to complete, and it was finished by 1086. So, why did William do it? The main reason was to find out exactly how much wealth there was in England and to make sure everyone was paying the correct amount of tax. But it just wasn't about money though, it was also about control. By documenting land ownership so precisely, William made it clear that all land ultimately belonged to him, and anyone who held that land did so because he allowed it. And the Domesday Book was also used to resolve disputes over land ownership and such like. Because William had given out so much land to his followers, there were often disagreements about who had the right to certain estates, etc. So the Domesday Book helped settle these disputes by providing a written record. Interestingly, some areas like London and Winchester weren't included in the Domesday Book at all, possibly because their wealth was too complicated to record accurately, or because William had other sources of income from those cities. So the next thing we're going to look at in terms of William and the control that he enforced over the Anglo-Saxons was the introduction of something called the Forest Laws. These were a really powerful tool to assert his authority. These laws turned large areas of land into, and these included forests, but even fields, clearings, anything really, even whole villages, into something called royal forests. They were exclusively reserved for the king's hunting. An example of a famous one would be the New Forest in the south of England. It covers like Hampshire, parts of Wiltshire. This is probably one of the most famous examples of William's forests. But this wasn't about environmental conservation or anything like that. This was rather about William establishing his power over the land, as controlling hunting grounds was a symbol of elite status. By the end of his reign, around 20% of southern England had been designated as royal forests. The Forest Laws then imposed strict restrictions on what Anglo-Saxons could do on this land. Activities like hunting, gathering firewood, farming became illegal if you didn't have the king's permission. Anyone who violated these laws faced severe penalties with fines or even mutilation for serious offences like poaching deer. These harsh measures made the laws extremely unpopular among the Anglo-Saxons, many of whom relied on these forests for survival. Punishments like blinding for poaching weren't just about justice, they were meant to send a message that disobeying the king's laws would not be tolerated. And it was about money as well. Economically, the Forest Laws provided William with a new revenue source. People could be fined for breaking the Forest Laws, and this helped fill the crown's coffers. And they also tightened William's control over the population by making the Anglo-Saxons more economically dependent on the Normans. Forest laws effectively reduced and limited the resources available to the local population, and so their independence was diminished, and it reminded them of their king's dominance. This control over resources strengthened William's grip on the economy, enforcing Norman power from the ground up. Over time, the Forest Laws contributed to the ongoing resentment against Norman rule as they stripped Anglo-Saxons of rights that they'd enjoyed for generations. They created a deep divide between the Anglo-Saxons and the Norman elite, who saw the forests as symbols of privilege and authority. So, although these laws would eventually face resistance, they served William's purpose well, helping him to solidify his control and ensure that Anglo-Saxon England understood that its land and its people were firmly under William's control. So finally, let's look at how William controlled the church. So the church was an incredibly powerful establishment in medieval England, and it had influence over not just religion but education, law and politics. So William knew that to truly control the country he needed to control the church as well. And after becoming king, William began replacing Anglo-Saxon bishops with Norman clergy or Norman people of the church. The most famous of these was a guy, he was called Lanfranc. He was an Italian monk who became the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. Lanfranc helped William reform the church, bringing it in line with Norman customs and making it more obedient to the king. So William also ordered the rebuilding of many churches and cathedrals in the Norman style, which often involved larger, more elaborate stone structures. These new churches symbolised Norman dominance and a break from the old Anglo-Saxon ways. For example, Durham Cathedral, which was begun in 1093, became one of the first examples of Norman architecture in England. But William wasn't willing to give the church too much power. He made it clear that while the church could manage spiritual matters, he was the ultimate authority in England. In 1076, he even declared that no pope could be acknowledged in England, and no church council could be held without his permission. This limited the influence of the Pope and ensured that William remained in control. Well, that brings us to the end of the video there. That should have hopefully given you a pretty good idea of the types of methods that William used to control the Anglo-Saxons. If you enjoyed that video, please do have a look at some of the others that are popping up on the screen, or whatever they do here on YouTube. But yeah, and obviously like and subscribe and all that type of thing. You know what to do and all that. All right, okay. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully see you soon.